jungle had swallowed it whole. When the first European explorers hacked their way through the dense undergrowth of the Yucatán Peninsula in the 16th century, they stumbled upon something that stopped them cold. Massive stone pyramids, taller than anything they had seen outside of Egypt, rising out of the forest floor as if the earth itself had pushed them upward. Intricate carvings covered every surface, faces, glyphs, serpents, and calendars so precise they would not be fully decoded for another 400 years. Cities that had once housed hundreds of thousands of people, now silent, reclaimed by roots and vines and the slow patience of the rainforest. The explorers asked the local people who had built these things. The answer they received was not what they expected. "We did," the people said. "Our ancestors." This is the story of the Maya. Not a lost civilization, not a vanished people, not an ancient mystery waiting to be solved by outsiders. The Maya were and are one of the most sophisticated, resilient, and complex civilizations the world has ever produced. They built cities without metal tools or the wheel. They developed one of only a handful of fully independent writing systems in all of human history. They tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that rivals modern astronomy. They survived conquest, forced conversion, epidemic disease, and deliberate cultural erasure. And they are still here, millions of them, speaking Maya languages, practicing Maya traditions, and connecting with a past that stretches back more than 3,000 years. But the story of how they got here, how they rose, how they collapsed, how they endured is one of the most dramatic, complicated, and ultimately hopeful stories in the entire human record. To understand it, we have to go back, way back, to a time before the pyramids, before the writing, before the cities, to the moment when a people began to transform a jungle into a world. The Maya homeland is not a single place. It is a vast and varied region stretching across what is today southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Roughly 250,000 square kilometers of lowland jungle, highland valleys, coastal plains, and volcanic mountains. This is not an easy landscape. The lowlands are hot, humid, and seasonally flooded. The highlands are cold and rugged. Fresh water is scarce in many areas. The soil, though lush in appearance, is often thin and difficult to farm sustainably over long periods. And yet, it was here, in this demanding and complex environment, that one of the great civilizations of the ancient world took root. The earliest evidence of settled communities in the Maya region dates to around 2000 BCE, 4,000 years ago. These were small villages of farmers growing maize, beans, and squash, living in simple structures, trading with neighboring communities. They were not yet Maya in the full cultural sense. They were the ancestors of the Maya, laying down the foundations without knowing what would eventually rise upon them. Something shifted around 1000 BCE. Villages grew larger, trade networks expanded. Certain settlements began to accumulate wealth and power at the expense of others. The first hints of social hierarchy appeared. Some burials were richer than others. Some structures were grander. Some individuals were clearly more important in death as they had been in life. This is the beginning of what archaeologists call the pre-classic period, and it would last for more than 1,000 years, slowly building pressure towards something extraordinary. The site of Nac Bay, deep in the Petén jungle of northern Guatemala, gives us our first glimpse of what was coming. By around 600 BCE, Nac Bay had already begun constructing monumental architecture, large stone platforms and structures that required organized labor on a significant scale. This was not a village anymore. This was something new, and it was just the beginning. The real breakthrough came at a site called El Mirador, not far from Nac Bay, which by around 300 BCE had grown into what may have been the largest city in the ancient Americas. Let that land for a moment. The largest city in the ancient Americas, and most people have never heard of it. El Mirador's central pyramid complex, known as La Danta, contains by volume more construction material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was connected to neighboring cities by raised causeways, paved roads built through the jungle, some stretching for dozens of kilometers. The population of the El Mirador Basin may have reached tens of thousands of people. This was the first great experiment in Maya urbanism, and it was already breathtaking. But it did not last. Sometime around 150 CE, El Mirador and many of the great pre-classic cities collapsed, abandoned, left to the jungle. Historians and archaeologists still debate why. Drought is the leading candidate. Combined with deforestation, the Maya had stripped the surrounding landscape to fuel their construction and agriculture, and without tree cover, the soil eroded, the water table dropped, and the agricultural system that supported the city began to fail. It is a pattern we will see again. A civilization that outgrows its environment, that takes more than the land can give, and pays the price. But here is what is remarkable. The collapse of El Mirador was not the end of the Maya. It was, in a strange way, a reset. A redistribution. The population dispersed, new centers emerged, and the knowledge, the traditions, the cultural DNA of what had been built at El Mirador was carried forward into a new era. The classic period of Maya civilization, stretching roughly from 250 CE to 900 CE, is what most people picture when they think of the ancient Maya. This is the era of the great cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, Caracol, Quirigua, each a sovereign state, each ruled by a divine king, each competing with its neighbors for land, trade, prestige, and survival. This is the era of the towering pyramids, the elaborate hieroglyphic texts, the sophisticated calendar systems, the breathtaking art. This is the peak, and it is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary cultural flowerings in human history. To understand classic Maya civilization, you have to understand one central idea, the divine king. The Maya ruler, called the Ajor, or sometimes the Kuhul Ajor, the Holy Lord, was not merely a political leader. He was a cosmic intermediary. He stood at the axis between the human world and the supernatural world, responsible for maintaining the balance between the two. His rituals, his bloodletting ceremonies, his military victories, his building projects, all of these were not just political acts. They were acts of cosmic maintenance. The king kept the universe running. This belief system shaped everything. It shaped the architecture. Temples were not just buildings, but mountains, sacred landscapes, portals to the underworld. It shaped the calendar. Time was not neutral but charged with meaning, certain days favorable, others dangerous, and the king's job was to navigate that sacred time correctly. It shaped warfare. Maya battles were not primarily about territorial conquest in the early classic period, but about capturing noble and royal prisoners whose sacrifice would feed the gods and maintain the cosmic order. And it shaped the political geography of the Maya world, which was never a unified empire but always a constellation of competing city-states, each with its own royal dynasty, its own patron gods, its own sphere of influence. This is one of the great distinctions between the Maya and, say, the Romans or the Aztecs. The Maya never built an empire in the traditional sense. There was no single capital, no single ruler who commanded all the others. Instead, the Maya world was a multipolar system of dozens of sovereign cities, connected by trade, diplomacy, marriage alliances, and war, more like ancient Greece than ancient Rome. And like ancient Greece, this competition drove extraordinary cultural achievement. Tikal, in the heart of the Petén lowlands of Guatemala, is perhaps the most iconic of the classic Maya cities. At its peak, around 700 CE, Tikal may have housed a population of 100,000 people or more, a number that rivals the great cities of medieval Europe, and this in the middle of a tropical rainforest. Its central precinct contained at least 6 massive temple pyramids, the tallest of which, Temple 4th, rises 65 meters above the jungle floor. Standing on its summit, you are above the forest canopy, and on a clear morning you can watch the sun rise over an ocean of green that stretches to the horizon in every direction. It is one of the most powerful experiences the ancient world has to offer. But Tikal was not always dominant. One of the most fascinating stories of the classic period is the great geopolitical rivalry between Tikal and its northern rival, Calakmul, a city so large and so powerful that it dominated much of the Maya lowlands for centuries, yet remained almost unknown to modern scholars until the 1990s because the jungle had hidden it so completely. For roughly 2 centuries, from around 500 CE to 700 CE, Calakmul and Tikal fought a cold war, and sometimes a hot one, for supremacy in the Maya world. Calakmul built a network of allied cities that surrounded Tikal, cutting off its trade routes and isolating it diplomatically. In 562 CE, Calakmul and its allies dealt Tikal a catastrophic military defeat, capturing Tikal's king and sacrificing him. Tikal went into what archaeologists call a hiatus, a period of roughly 130 years during which it erected almost no new monuments and seems to have been politically subordinated to its rivals. Then, in 695 CE, Tikal struck back. Its king, Jasochan Kawil I, defeated and captured the king of Calakmul in battle. It was a reversal of fortune so dramatic that Tikal commemorated it on multiple monuments, and the city entered a new golden age of construction and artistic achievement. The rivalry between these two superpowers, played out across 2 centuries and hundreds of kilometers of jungle, is as dramatic as anything in the history of the ancient world, and we know about it not from outside observers, but from the Maya's own written records, carved in stone. Because this is the other thing that sets the Maya apart. They wrote everything down. The Maya hieroglyphic writing system is one of the great intellectual achievements of human history. It is a fully functional writing system, capable of recording not just names and dates, but complex historical narratives, theological arguments, political propaganda, astronomical observations, and poetry. It uses a combination of logograms, where a single sign represents a whole word, and syllabic signs, where signs represent individual syllables, allowing for extraordinary flexibility and precision. For most of the 20th century, scholars believed Maya hieroglyphs were primarily calendrical and astronomical, records of dates and celestial events, but not true historical writing. The breakthrough came in the 1950s and 1960s, when a Russian linguist named Yuri Knorozov, working largely from photographs and without ever visiting a Maya site, cracked the phonetic basis of the script. His work was initially rejected by the dominant figures in Maya studies, partly on academic grounds and partly, it must be said, because he was Soviet and the Cold War made his ideas politically inconvenient. But he was right, and the field eventually caught up. By the 1980s and 1990s, a generation of scholars, many of them building on Knorozov's foundation, had unlocked the historical content of the inscriptions, and what they found was astonishing. The stelae, the tall carved stone monuments that stand in the plazas of Maya cities, were not just calendrical records. They were historical documents. They recorded the births, accessions, marriages, military victories, and deaths of real kings. They named real places, real events, real people. The Maya had written their own history in stone, and after 1,000 years of silence, we were finally learning to read it. This is one of the great wow moments in the history of archaeology. Imagine standing in front of a stone monument that has been sitting in the jungle for 1,200 years and suddenly being able to read it. Suddenly understanding that this carving is telling you the story of a king's victory over his rival, the name of the captured enemy, the date of the battle, the ritual that followed. The stone becomes a voice. The silence of the jungle becomes a conversation. The Maya also kept books, screenfold manuscripts made of bark paper, covered in hieroglyphic text and painted illustrations. These were called codices, and they existed in enormous numbers. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Maya libraries contained thousands of them. We know this because a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa described them, and then he burned them. In 1562, in the town of Mani in the Yucatán, de Landa oversaw the destruction of an unknown number of Maya codices, along with ritual objects, idols, and other cultural artifacts, in what he called an auto da fe, an act of faith. He later wrote, with what seems to have been genuine puzzlement at the Maya's distress, that the Maya regretted this to an amazing degree, and it caused them great affliction. Of the thousands of Maya books that once existed, only 4 survive today. 4. Everything else, the literature, the history, the science, the theology, the poetry of an entire civilization, is gone. It is one of the great cultural catastrophes in human history, and it was deliberate. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before the Spanish arrived, before the conquest, before the burning, the Maya world had already experienced its own catastrophe, one that remains to this day one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology, the classic Maya collapse. Between roughly 800 CE and 1000 CE, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Quirigua, and dozens of others, were abandoned. Not conquered, not destroyed in battle, not buried by volcanic eruption. Abandoned. The population of the southern lowlands, which may have reached 2 million people at its peak, declined by an estimated 50 to 90%. Entire regions that had been densely populated for centuries became, within a few generations, empty jungle. The last dated monument in the southern lowlands was erected in 909 CE at a site called Tonina. After that, silence. What happened? This is a question that has occupied archaeologists, historians, and scientists for more than a century, And the honest answer is that we still do not have a complete explanation. What we do have is a growing body of evidence pointing to a convergence of multiple factors, a perfect storm that overwhelmed a civilization that had, for centuries, been pushing the limits of what its environment could sustain. The most compelling evidence points to prolonged drought. Paleoclimatological studies, analyses of lake sediments, cave formations called speleothems, and other natural archives have revealed that the period from roughly 800 to 1000 CE was marked by a series of severe and prolonged droughts across the Maya lowlands. In a civilization that depended entirely on rainfall agriculture and carefully managed water storage systems, multi-year droughts would have been catastrophic. Crops failed, reservoirs emptied. Populations that had grown fat on centuries of agricultural surplus suddenly faced starvation. But drought alone does not explain the collapse. The Maya had survived droughts before. What made this different was the context, a civilization already under severe stress from multiple directions simultaneously. Warfare had intensified dramatically in the late Classic period. The political system of competing city-states, which had driven so much cultural achievement, had also created a landscape of chronic conflict. As resources became scarcer, whether from drought, soil exhaustion, or population pressure, competition for those resources became more violent. Inscriptions from the late Classic period show a sharp increase in warfare, in the capture and sacrifice of prisoners, in the political fragmentation of previously stable alliances. Cities that had once been subordinate allies were breaking free, carving out their own power, attacking their neighbors. The geopolitical order of the Classic period was dissolving. At the same time, the agricultural system was failing from within. The Maya had practiced intensive agriculture for centuries, terracing hillsides, draining and farming wetlands, cutting down forests to plant crops. But this had consequences. Deforestation led to soil erosion. Intensive farming depleted soil nutrients. The very productivity that had allowed the population to grow was undermining the ecological foundation that made that productivity possible. This is not unique to the Maya. It is a pattern visible in the collapse of many ancient civilizations, but in the Maya case, the scale and speed of the environmental degradation appears to have been particularly severe. And then there was the political crisis. The divine kingship system, which had been the organizing principle of classic Maya society, was losing its legitimacy. Kings who could not deliver rain, could not guarantee harvests, could not protect their people from rival cities. These kings were failing at the most fundamental level of their cosmic mandate. The ideological contract between ruler and ruled was breaking down. There is evidence at some sites of what looks like internal revolt, monuments defaced, elite residences destroyed, the symbols of royal power deliberately damaged. All of these factors, drought, warfare, ecological degradation, political collapse, loss of ideological legitimacy, came together in the late 8th and 9th centuries in a cascading crisis that the southern lowland cities could not survive. One by one, they were abandoned. The people did not vanish. They moved north to the Yucatán Peninsula, where water was more accessible through natural sinkholes called cenotes, and where a new phase of Maya civilization was already beginning. They moved to the highlands of Guatemala. They dispersed into smaller communities. They survived, but the great cities of the south were left to the jungle. Here is what is crucial to understand, and what is so often misrepresented in popular accounts of the Maya. The Classic collapse was not the end of Maya civilization, it was a transformation. A brutal, devastating, painful transformation, but a transformation, not an extinction. The northern Yucatán had been developing its own distinct Maya culture throughout the Classic period, and in the aftermath of the southern collapse, it flourished. Cities like Uxmal, Cabar, and the extraordinary Chichen Itza grew in power and sophistication. Chichen Itza in particular became one of the great cities of the medieval world, a cosmopolitan center that shows clear evidence of contact and exchange with central Mexico, particularly with the Toltec culture of Tula. The famous pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, known today as El Castillo, is an architectural calendar. Its staircases and panels are calibrated so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the play of light and shadow creates the illusion of a serpent descending the northern staircase. This is not coincidence. This is deliberate, precise astronomical engineering built into the very structure of a stone pyramid. The political organization of the northern lowlands was different from the classic south, more confederate, more mercantile, less dominated by the cult of the individual divine king. Trade networks extended across the Gulf of Mexico and down the Caribbean coast. The Maya of the post-classic period were sophisticated long-distance traders, moving goods including obsidian, jade, cacao, salt, and copper across vast distances. They were, by any measure, a thriving civilization. Chichen Itza itself eventually declined around 1200 CE and was succeeded as the dominant power in the northern lowlands by a city called Mayapan, a walled city that attempted something the classic Maya had never achieved, a centralized political authority over much of the Yucatan Peninsula. Mayapan's experiment lasted for about 2 centuries before it too collapsed, around 1450 CE, in a period of internal conflict and political fragmentation that left the Yucatan divided into a patchwork of small, competing kingdoms. This is the world the Spanish encountered when they arrived in the early 16th century. Not a unified Maya empire that could be decapitated with a single military stroke, as Hernán Cortés had done to the Aztec Empire by capturing its capital Tenochtitlan. Instead, the Spanish found dozens of independent Maya states, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own political interests. Conquering the Maya took the Spanish not weeks or months but decades, and in some regions, more than a century and a half. The conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula began in earnest in the 1520s and was not completed until the 1540s, and even then, completed is too strong a word. The Maya of the interior continued to resist. The Itza Maya, centered at a city called Nojpeten on an island in Lake Petén Itzá in what is today northern Guatemala, maintained their independence until 1697, more than 170 years after the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish had to mount a full military expedition to finally subdue them, and even after that, Maya resistance continued in various forms for centuries. This is the pattern that defines the Maya story in the colonial and post-colonial periods: resistance, adaptation, survival. The Spanish imposed Christianity, but the Maya integrated it with their own religious traditions, creating a syncretic spiritual culture that persists to this day. The Spanish burned the books, but Maya scribes continued to write, in the Latin alphabet now, rather than hieroglyphs, but in the Maya language, preserving histories, calendars and traditions in documents like the Chilambalam books and the extraordinary Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh deserves a moment of its own. It is the great creation epic of the Quiché Maya of highland Guatemala, written down in the Latin alphabet sometime in the mid-16th century by anonymous Maya authors who were preserving a much older oral and written tradition. The Popol Vuh tells the story of the creation of the world, the adventures of the hero twins who defeat the lords of the underworld, and the creation of humanity from maize, an origin story that reflects the central importance of corn to Maya life and thought. It is a work of profound literary and philosophical depth, and it survived only because someone, in the dangerous early decades of the colonial period, had the foresight and the courage to write it down. The colonial period was catastrophic for the Maya in ways that go far beyond military conquest. The diseases that the Spanish brought with them, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, swept through indigenous populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. The demographic collapse was staggering. Estimates vary widely, but scholars generally believe that the indigenous population of Mesoamerica declined by somewhere between 50 and 90% in the century following European contact. This was not primarily the result of violence. It was the result of epidemic disease, and it was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. For the Maya, this meant the loss of elders who carried traditional knowledge, the disruption of communities and social structures, the collapse of agricultural systems, and the destruction of the cultural continuity that had sustained Maya civilization for millennia. And yet, and this is the remarkable thing, Maya culture survived, diminished, transformed, under enormous pressure but alive. Through the colonial period and into the 19th and 20th centuries, Maya communities maintained their languages, their agricultural practices, their ritual calendars, their oral traditions, and their sense of collective identity. This was not without enormous cost. Maya people in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador faced discrimination, forced labor, land dispossession, and violence at the hands of colonial and post-colonial governments. In Guatemala, the late 20th century saw a brutal civil war in which Maya communities were specifically targeted by the military government, a period of violence that a United Nations-sponsored Truth Commission later characterized as genocide. More than 200,000 people were killed or disappeared, the vast majority of them Maya, and yet the Maya endured. Today, there are approximately 7 million Maya people living across southern Mexico and Central America. They speak more than 30 distinct Maya languages, not dialects of a single language, but genuinely distinct languages, though related to one another as French is related to Spanish. Maya cultural organizations, language revitalization movements, and political advocacy groups are active across the region. Maya scholars are contributing to the archaeological and historical study of their own civilization, bringing perspectives and knowledge that outside researchers had missed for generations. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphics, still ongoing, still yielding new discoveries, has been a collaborative process that increasingly includes Maya scholars themselves. And what those inscriptions reveal, read alongside the archaeological evidence, is a civilization of extraordinary complexity and achievement. Let us pause here and take stock of what the Maya actually accomplished, because it is easy to get lost in the drama of collapse and conquest and miss the sheer scale of what was built. The Maya developed one of only 5 or 6 fully independent writing systems in all of human history. Every other writing system in the world either derived from one of these originals or was inspired by contact with literate cultures. The Maya did it on their own, in isolation from the Old World, developing a system sophisticated enough to record the full range of human thought and experience. The Maya calendar system is not one calendar but several interlocking cycles. The most famous is the long count calendar, which tracks time in a grand cycle of approximately 5,125 years. The cycle that ended on December 21, 2012, generating enormous popular excitement and a wave of apocalyptic predictions that the Maya themselves, it should be noted, found somewhat baffling. The long count was a tool for situating historical events in deep time, for connecting the present to the mythological past, for giving kings a cosmic context for their reigns. It was an extraordinary intellectual achievement, requiring sophisticated mathematical thinking, including the concept of zero, which the Maya developed independently, at roughly the same time as mathematicians in India were doing the same thing, and centuries before it reached Europe. Maya astronomy was equally sophisticated. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of Venus as both morning star and evening star, with extraordinary precision, developing tables that allowed them to predict Venus's appearances and disappearances centuries into the future. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, to within a fraction of a day. They did this without telescopes, without modern mathematics, using only careful naked eye observation recorded over generations. The Dresden Codex, one of the 4 surviving Maya books, contains Venus tables that modern astronomers have verified for their accuracy. Maya architecture, which we have already touched on, was not just monumental, but mathematically and astronomically precise. The alignment of buildings to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of particular stars was not coincidental. It was intentional, reflecting a worldview in which the built environment was a mirror of the cosmic order. The engineering required to construct structures like Temple 5A at Tikal or La Danta at El Mirador, without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, involves sophisticated knowledge of geometry, materials science, and organizational management that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. And Maya agriculture, often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic achievements of architecture and astronomy, was a genuine marvel of ecological engineering. The Maya farmed raised fields in wetlands, terraced hillsides to prevent erosion, maintained sophisticated water management systems including reservoirs and canals, and practiced a form of polyculture, growing multiple crops together that maintained soil fertility far better than monoculture. The milpa system of rotating cultivation, which the Maya developed and which is still practiced today, is one of the most sustainable agricultural systems ever devised in the humid tropics. None of this happened by accident. It happened because the Maya, over more than 3,000 years, were relentlessly curious, intellectually ambitious, and deeply committed to understanding the world around them, the physical world of soil and water and sky, and the metaphysical world of gods and time and cosmic order. There is something else about the Maya that deserves attention, something that cuts against the popular image of ancient civilizations as uniformly hierarchical and static. The Maya world was dynamic. It changed. It adapted. It absorbed influences from neighboring cultures and transformed them into something distinctly its own. The post-classic Maya of the Yucatán were different from the classic Maya of the Petén lowlands, who were different again from the pre-classic Maya of El Mirador. This was not cultural decay. It was cultural evolution, the same underlying traditions and values expressed in new forms in response to new circumstances. This capacity for adaptation is, in the end, what explains the most remarkable fact about the Maya: they are still here. When we talk about the collapse of the Maya, we are talking about the abandonment of specific cities in a specific region during a specific period. We are not talking about the disappearance of a people or a culture. The Maya did not vanish. They transformed, migrated, adapted, and survived through the collapse of their classic cities, through Spanish conquest, through epidemic disease, through colonial exploitation, through the violence of the 20th century. This is a story that matters not just as history, but as a statement about human resilience, about what it means for a culture to survive, about the difference between the loss of monuments and the loss of a people. The pyramids of Tikal can be reclaimed by the jungle and still the Maya endure. The books can be burned and still the stories survive, passed down in memory and oral tradition until someone finds a way to write them down again. The language can be suppressed, and still grandmothers whisper it to grandchildren in the darkness. There is a Maya concept that captures something of this. The idea that the ancestors are not gone but present, that the past is not behind us but around us, that time is not a line moving from past to future but a cycle, always returning. This is not mere mysticism. It is a sophisticated philosophy of time and continuity that the Maya encoded in their calendar systems, their architecture, their rituals, and their stories. And it turns out to be, in a deep sense, true, not in the supernatural sense, but in the human sense. The past is around us. The ancestors are present in the languages we speak, the foods we eat, the ways we organize our communities and understand our world. For the Maya, this is not a metaphor. It is lived reality. The work of understanding Maya's civilization is far from complete. New sites are being discovered constantly. LIDAR surveys, which use laser pulses to map the ground beneath the jungle canopy, have revealed in the past decade that the Maya lowlands were even more densely populated and extensively modified than anyone had imagined. A 28-wide LIDAR survey of the Petén region of Guatemala revealed the remains of more than 60,000 previously unknown structures. Houses, palaces, temples, causeways, agricultural features hidden beneath the forest. The scale of classic Maya civilization, it turns out, was even larger than we thought. New hieroglyphic inscriptions are being deciphered. New archaeological excavations are revealing new details about daily life, about trade, about the experience of ordinary Maya people rather than just their kings. The story is getting richer, more complex, more human with every passing year. And crucially, the Maya themselves are part of this process. Maya scholars, archaeologists, linguists, and community leaders are engaged in the study and preservation of their own heritage in ways that were not possible or not permitted a generation ago. The story of the Maya is no longer being told only by outsiders looking in. It is being told increasingly by the Maya themselves. This matters. It matters because the history of the Maya has been told badly for a very long time. It has been told as a mystery who built these cities. As if the answer were not obvious, as if the descendants of the builders were not standing right there. It has been told as a tragedy, a great civilization that collapsed and disappeared. As if collapse were the end of the story rather than one chapter in an ongoing narrative. It has been told sometimes as a curiosity. Look at these ancient people and their strange beliefs and their remarkable buildings. As if the Maya were specimens to be examined rather than human beings with a continuous living culture. The real story is more interesting than any of these framings. It is the story of a people who, in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, built something extraordinary, not once but repeatedly, over thousands of years, across dozens of cities and cultures and political systems. Who developed writing and mathematics and astronomy independently of the old world, demonstrating that these are not the exclusive achievements of any one tradition, but the natural products of human curiosity, given enough time and freedom to develop. Who survived everything that history threw at them? Environmental collapse, military conquest, epidemic disease, cultural erasure, and who are still here, still speaking their languages, still practicing their traditions, still telling their stories. The jungle has given back some of what it swallowed. The stones speak again, to those who have learned to read them. And the people never stopped speaking. If you have made it this far, you already know that this story is nowhere near finished. There are dozens of Maya cities still being excavated, dozens of hieroglyphic texts still being deciphered, dozens of communities still working to preserve and revitalize their languages and traditions. The Maya are not an ancient mystery. They are a living civilization with a past that stretches back more than 3,000 years and a future that is still being written. And that is exactly why stories like this one matter. History is not a collection of dead facts about people who are gone. It is the living context that explains how we got here and who we are. All of us, not just those whose history gets told most often. If this story moved you, if it made the ancient world feel a little more real and the present feel a little more connected to the past, then consider subscribing to this channel, because this is what we do here. We take the great stories of human civilization and we tell them the way they deserve to be told, with honesty about what we know and what we do not, with respect for the people whose lives we are describing, and with genuine awe at what human beings are capable of when they are given time, resources, and freedom to create. Leave a comment below telling me what surprised you most about the Maya. Was it the scale of El Mirador, the sophistication of their astronomy, the fact that the conquest of the last independent Maya city was not completed until 1697, or something else entirely? I read every comment, and your questions often shape future videos. And if you want to stay in this part of the world and this period of history, the next video is waiting for you, because the Maya did not exist in isolation. They were part of a broader world of Mesoamerican civilizations, connected by trade and conflict, and shared ideas to cultures that were doing equally extraordinary things just a few hundred kilometers away. That story is just as dramatic, just as complex, and just as important. I will see you there. But before we get there, let us return one more time to the jungle. Because there is something that does not fully come through in the archaeological reports, in the decipherment papers, in the academic debates about drought cycles and political fragmentation. Something that only becomes real when you are actually standing in one of these places. Tikal at dawn is unlike anything else on Earth. You arrive in the dark before the tourists, before the heat, and you walk through the forest on paths that wind between root systems as large as walls. The jungle is already awake. Howler monkeys calling from somewhere in the canopy above you. A sound so deep and resonant it seems to come from the earth itself rather than from any living creature. And then the trees thin and you step into the great plaza, and there they are, Temple I and Temple II, facing each other across a flat stone plaza, their stepped profiles rising against a sky that is just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. They have been standing here for more than 1,200 years. They were built by people who knew they were building something that would outlast them, outlast their children, outlast their civilization. They were right, and in that moment, with the howler monkeys and the blue sky and the ancient stone, the distance between you and them collapses. You are not looking at ruins, you are looking at an act of human will, preserved in limestone, still speaking across the centuries. This is what the Maya built. Not just pyramids and calendars and writing systems, but meaning. They built a way of understanding the world that was coherent and comprehensive and beautiful, and they encoded it in stone and bark paper and language and ritual, and they passed it down through generations that survived everything history could throw at them. The question that haunts the study of the Maya, the question that haunts the study of every great civilization that has faced catastrophe, is what we can learn from them. Not in the shallow sense of extracting lessons like fortune cookies from the past, but in the deeper sense of understanding the conditions under which human societies flourish and the conditions under which they collapse. The Maya story offers no simple lessons. It does not say that environmental stewardship is sufficient to prevent collapse, because the Maya practiced sophisticated ecological management for centuries before the system broke down. It does not say that cultural achievement protects against political failure, because the most artistically and intellectually productive period of Maya history was also a period of chronic warfare and political instability. It does not say that collapse is permanent, because the Maya collapsed and recovered across more than 3,000 years. What it does say, what the evidence seems to support, is that resilience is not a single quality, but a combination of many. The ability to adapt, the capacity to maintain cultural identity through transformation, the preservation of knowledge across generations even when the institutions that originally produced that knowledge are gone, the willingness to incorporate new elements, new technologies, new ideas, new political forms, without abandoning the core of what makes a culture distinctly itself. The Maya had all of these qualities, and they needed all of them. Consider what the Maya language family alone represents. More than 30 distinct languages, spoken today by millions of people across 5 countries, all descended from a common ancestor spoken thousands of years ago. Languages like Yucatec Maya, Kich, Tzeltal, Tzotzil, Mam, and Kachikal, each with its own literature, its own oral traditions, its own way of carving up and describing the world. The survival of these languages through conquest and suppression and deliberate policies of cultural erasure is itself one of the great stories of human resilience. In Mexico's Chiapas state, in the highlands of Guatemala, in the lowlands of Belize and the Yucatán Peninsula, Maya communities are today engaged in active efforts to document, teach, and revitalize their languages. Young Maya people are learning to read hieroglyphics, not as a purely academic exercise, but as a way of reconnecting with ancestors whose voices were silenced for centuries by the burning of books and the suppression of indigenous education. There is something profoundly moving about a 20-year-old Maya student sitting with a photograph of a stone inscription and sounding out the syllables of a language that has been spoken in an unbroken chain from that carved stone to this living voice. The archaeological work continues to reshape our understanding in ways that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. The LIDAR revolution, the use of airborne laser mapping to see through the jungle canopy, has not just revealed new structures. It has fundamentally changed our model of how classic Maya society was organized. The old image of Maya cities as isolated centers surrounded by empty jungle has been replaced by a picture of a densely interconnected landscape, almost continuously settled across vast areas, with intensive agriculture filling every available space between the great ceremonial centers. This means the Maya lowlands at their peak were not a collection of city-states separated by wilderness. They were something closer to a continuous urban and agricultural landscape, a civilization that had transformed its entire environment over centuries of sustained effort. The scale of this transformation is staggering, and it helps explain both the extraordinary productivity of classic Maya civilization and the severity of its eventual collapse. Because a landscape so thoroughly modified is also a landscape made fragile, dependent on the continued functioning of the systems, agricultural, hydrological, political, that maintain it. One of the most poignant findings of recent archaeology is the evidence for what ordinary Maya people experienced during the collapse. Elite monuments give us the king's perspective, their victories, their divine mandates, their cosmic significance. But excavations of ordinary houses, analysis of human remains, study of agricultural features and water systems, these give us a different perspective. They show us people who continued to plant their fields and maintain their households even as the political order around them disintegrated, who adapted their diets as preferred foods became scarce, who moved their communities to new locations when the old ones became untenable, who kept living, in other words, even as the civilization that had organized their world fell apart around them. This is the human story beneath the grand historical narrative. Not kings and calendars, but families making decisions about where to go and how to survive and what to carry with them when they left. The woman who packed the family's grinding stone when she abandoned her house for the last time. The farmer who chose to plant his milpa one more season in a valley that was becoming dangerously dry, hoping the rains would return. The scribe who wrote down the old stories in a new alphabet, because he understood that if no one wrote them down, they would be lost. These are the people who carried Maya civilization through its darkest periods. Not the kings whose names are carved on the stelae, but the millions of unnamed individuals who kept the languages alive, kept the agricultural knowledge alive, kept the stories alive, kept the calendar alive in their communities, even when the great ceremonial centers that had once organized the calendar's public celebration were empty and overgrown. There is a particular kind of courage in cultural continuity. It does not look like the courage of the battlefield or the throne room. It looks like a grandmother teaching her grandchildren words in a language that the government has told them not to speak. It looks like a community maintaining a ritual that the church has declared sinful. It looks like a farmer using techniques that his ancestors developed over centuries, techniques that work better than the ones being promoted by outside experts, even when the outside world tells him he is backward and primitive for doing so. The Maya have been exercising this kind of courage for 500 years since the conquest, and for thousands of years before it. It is, in the end, the most remarkable thing about them. Not the pyramids, though the pyramids are extraordinary. Not the calendar, though the calendar is a genuine intellectual marvel. Not the writing system, though the writing system stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements. The most remarkable thing about the Maya is that they are still here. Still speaking, still farming, still celebrating, still connecting the present to a past that stretches back to the beginning of settled life in the Americas. The jungle is patient. It waited 1,000 years to reclaim Tikal, and it will wait another 1,000 if it must. But the people do not wait. The people move forward, carrying their past with them, writing the next chapter of a story that began 3,000 years ago and shows no sign of ending. That story belongs to the Maya. We are fortunate that they have chosen to share it with the rest of the world. If this journey through Maya history left you wanting more, if you found yourself caught between the grandeur of Tikal at dawn and the quiet courage of the people who kept these traditions alive through centuries of pressure, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Subscribe if you have not already, and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Share this video with someone who thinks ancient history has nothing to teach us, because the Maya alone are proof that it has everything to teach us. And if one moment in this story stayed with you, one fact, one image, one idea that shifted something in how you see the ancient world, tell me about it in the comments. That conversation is where the real learning happens, and I genuinely want to hear what this story meant to you.